As a facilitator at Gravity Learning, you'll be bringing a lot of new and interesting information to people. You'll be making recommendations about how they might do things differently and change their life. And the problem is, a lot of people won't believe you. In fact, an interesting study done at Harvard and published in the Harvard Management Journal said that over 50%, 52% of people just don't believe you by default unless they understand where your information is coming from. And so if we're bringing new suggestions and different ways to work with people, what we might do is always lead with where the information is coming from before we start telling people how to do things. This sets people up to believe you and gives you credibility in a way that great storytelling and the other parts of presentations often don't do. Well, this leads us, of course, to, okay then, what's the best way to bring a source, to bring information to people? And that's what we'll be talking about today. We will unveil the structure of telling stories, of introducing research that you can use over and over and over again as a Gravity Learning facilitator. If you follow this simple structure, what you'll find is that audiences are engaged and right there with you in a way that's so much stronger than what we're used to, especially when you're dealing with science or engineering or finance audiences, of which we have much. So what's the most important thing about quoting research? And what's interesting is that there's research about that. This comes from a study published in the Journal of Reference Services Review, and what they were most interested was when quoting research, what makes the biggest impact? And what they found was that the largest impact comes from where that research was published. For example, if you say something like, this comes from a journal article published in the Journal of Reference Services Review, is a much higher impact than if you say, this comes from a study, or studies show, or scientists have found, or research finds. You quote the journal that it comes from. This comes from a study published in the Journal of blah, 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 blah. In fact, you might stop right now, take a look at the screen, and practice a couple of times saying, this information comes from this journal. Get yourself used to leading with that. Now, quoting research at people is useful, and it does work, and we all also know that human beings really plug into stories. And so if we can plug into the story of the research, then we get the benefits of quoting research at people so that they're more likely to believe you, and giving them a story so that they're more likely to take action. Right? The research makes it credible, and the stories are what drive action, right? So what we might consider doing is plugging our story of the research into common storytelling structures. Now, you might be wondering, what is a common storytelling structure that I can plug into? And we would be remiss if we didn't bring the research around that. This comes from a really interesting study published in the Journal of Psycholinguistic Research, where what they were interested in wasn't just stories, it was good stories. What are good stories made of? What are the structures of good stories? And they found that there are different types of structures of good stories, but that they all fell into an overall kind of story arcing structure. These here are the 4 steps that Gravity Learning facilitators use to introduce research. You might consider writing them down and memorizing and practicing the heck out of them, because the first step is quoting the journal or publication that the research comes from. Then we say what the scientists or researchers were interested in. Basically, what kind of problem were they trying to solve? What were they trying to figure out? Next, we say what they found. And then we tell our audience what that means. And in doing this, we plug into the structure of storytelling. For example, check this out. So this comes from a story published in the Journal of Psycholinguistic Research, and what the researchers were interested in wasn't just stories, but what made those stories good. And what they found was that within the best stories, there's a structure, number of structures really, but they all kind of follow one structure. And so what you might consider doing is following that same structure when you introduce stories at Gravity Learning. Pretty interesting, isn't it? Okay, so let's do this. press pause and take a couple of seconds or minutes or hours, if you will, to try on this structure of introducing research. It's always, always, always the name of the journal or publication first, followed by what the researchers were interested in, and then what they found, and then what that means. What you might consider doing right now is pressing pause and telling the story of this slide a couple of times. Get yourself used to playing with it. Let's see it work again. So for example, one of the things at Gravity Learning that we're really concerned about is keeping people on camera. In 2017, a study published in the Journal of Computers and Human Behavior, where they try to figure out how computers and humans get along, examined the idea right here of what makes people pay attention when they're connecting remotely. And what they found is that the lack of a camera is the number one thing that plugs into what they called online disinhibition. Basically means people just do whatever they want to do. And what's interesting is that they think it's because there's no eye contact. That person doesn't see you seeing them, and so they just do whatever. In fact, what's interesting is that it's almost impossible to stay out of email or keep yourself from multitasking if you don't have the camera on. You do it, don't you? So what you might consider doing is making sure that all of your team members have a camera on while you're in online meetings. Notice that what we did is we told the story of the research. We started with the journal publication. We talked about what they were interested in. We talked about what they found and a couple of other little details, and then what that means. And it's pretty powerful, isn't it? Okay, press pause and try it again. Introduce with those 4 steps this slide. Let's get people to turn their cameras on by telling them the research behind why we turn our cameras on. Now, what's most important here is that we start every educational learning journey with research. What you don't want to do is save the research until the end. Why not convince people that you're worth listening to in the beginning? As a Gravity Learning facilitator, you can learn this framework and then weave your own magic as you tell the stories of the research. So now it's time for memorizing. When we memorize a structure and then practice it, we can bring our own artistry to this talking. Again, the most important steps are always leading with the name of the journal, what the researchers were interested in, what they found, and then what that means. From here, we can launch into the learning journey and we'll have those people. We'll have them. What you might consider doing is downloading one of the Gravity Learning research guides. This is a research guide for courageous conversations, which is all about those conversations that are pretty difficult, and examine how the research guides follow this structure. You might even practice with some of these. One of the main pillars of Gravity Learning is that all our content is heavily research-based, and when we lead by introducing the research with a story of a research, we've got people right away. And the nice thing about it is the people you've got are generally the hardest people to convince. It's all downhill from there. Have fun.